I am unashamed. What about you?
Well, we had a borderline miracle today already, just on the way down here.
We did.
That
If a cat jumps up on the table, don't be shocked if you're watching this. So there's some cats in my house. I don't know where they came from. Somebody gave us cats, which I was like, it's just more things to take care of. So I wasn't crazy about it. But
good deed, Al.
Yeah,
good
I know.
deed.
Two kittens, and we do have some mice every once in a while. So maybe. But anyway, so they've got to where they've got a little habit of getting up in my truck or Jay's truck. They like to.
Yeah, but you didn't know this. I'll just tell what happened. You just drove.
So I drove
40 minutes.
Yeah, about 35, 40 minutes. I went to Chick-fil-A and got y'all some food, and I'm doing all my stuff.
So you're in the middle of town.
You've
done the fast food line.
So I pull up at your
interstate. You came across interstate. There's people
so,
blowing the horn. And all
and
that.
plus, I told y'all when I get out here.
Up under the hood.
Well, so I pull up and I get out of my truck. Daniel's with me. Daniel's new brother in Christ. But so we get out of the truck and walk in. I walk back out to my truck and I look and I see a cat. And I said, I said, I guess Mom got a cat. Looks a lot like the one in the house. So I went back in the house, didn't even think anything about it. We come back out and Dad sees it. He said, Miss Kay, you better get that cat because if Bobo sees him, it'll be all over. And so we scooped up the cat, Mom did. And I said, that's our cat. Then I thought, well, how'd he get here? So I realized that cat was up in the engine block somewhere and had quite the ride.
There's not a lot of places you can ride up under the hood of a.
But what's funny is wouldn't you think? So I stopped several times, red lights.
You would think the cat.
You'd think the cat would say, I need to get out of here because.
You know what that's called, Al?
Smart enough not to.
That's exactly right. It waited till we got here and stopped for a while. For
you know
20
what
minutes.
That's called? Grace.
Yeah.
And the cat's already has the limp because one of the dogs back home hurt his leg. And so that's when I knew.
So,
I said, that's
so you brought
well,
him with you inside the truck from up
Yeah.
the house
But,
to
uh,
here.
And Stone told me, he said he pulled up to the stop sign in our neighborhood the other day and he heard him meowing. They were both in his truck. And so he opened so he said now every time before he leaves the house, he opens up his hood to make sure they're not in the engine block.
There's something to be said about surviving.
Well, see, and there's some dogs around there. So
lady and Lynn, this could be a sign of the last days because when cats are hitchhiking, via vehicles,
Well, it could
I
be
think I'll
that.
just ride down there with them and jump up in there. And, a cat used to. I don't think they were that smart.
Well, you think about it, when humans want to move, they move. When a cat wants to move, he's got to be more creative. It may have something to do with the dog that was 100 times the size of the cat attacking it, and it lived.
It lived, but it's definitely kind of now always on the lookout. But they like getting up in the vehicles because the dogs can't get to them in there. So
I see why this idea about cats having 9 lives
Oh yeah,
came about.
well, that one spent a couple.
I think so.
So we're on 3 or 4 with this.
That was quite the marvel. So when I go back to town,
Who was that old
we'll get
actor,
to ride
old
up
guy,
front.
the karate expert? Hard to kill. That's kind of where cats are. Hard to kill.
I just heard something about him. He's like, he moved to Russia. That guy, that actor.
Where do you come up with all this?
I don't know. I just heard it recently. He's become infatuated with
I
Russia.
hope that catches on.
I attempted to watch a movie last night. I watch one about every couple of years. And Missy was like, let's watch a movie. So
I thought you would watch Risen because Dad was talking about Risen. About the
no, I
Romans
didn't
and terror.
watch it, but that was a good idea, and I appreciate it.
Yep.
Phil started a ministry where he's baptizing people with biblical names. You had Samuel
We had
day
Samuel
before
day before
yesterday.
yesterday, and we had Daniel yesterday.
Daniel yesterday. So Phil, that's quite the
Could be a sign of sorts. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe so.
yeah. Well, the signs and miracles and wonders that we're kind of joking about, they led to Jesus.
That's
so
right.
as long as you got Jesus.
So what was the movie you watched?
You know what? I can't remember what the name of it was,
but
but
it's not been very good.
Chris Pratt was in it, and Didn't he come
It's
to
like an
Willie's?
action movie.
He came to Willie's one time.
Yeah, he
And,
was. Well, I went over to Willie's. I didn't even know he was there. It was back when he lived across from you, Arizona. But I walk out back, and Willie's sitting there by the fire. And there's another guy, and there's Chris Pratt.
Yeah.
And so I had old Larry Hooper with me, and he had his guitar. And Pratt said, "Hey, you mind if I play your guitar?" So he just started playing Hooper's guitar and singing songs. I was like, "We're just."
Well, I
sitting
remember
around
that
the campfire.
happening. So Missy's like, "What do you want to watch?" I was like, "Hey, I know that guy." It's like, "Is he still doing movies?" Missy's like, "Is that a joke?" So I said, "Well, let's watch that." It was like Tomorrow's War or something was the name of it.
Oh yeah,
You've seen it?
I haven't seen it, but I saw the previews for it. It looked pretty good.
I lasted halfway.
Oh boy,
halfway through it.
Not bad.
And not that it was terrible. It just, it's a time. I have a problem if you want to make movies out of Hollywood, because people in Hollywood tend to down people of faith. I'm like, quit using our principles to gain your storyline. So they had a futuristic war that they had to travel through time,
right?
Because somebody figured out that the humanity was going to be extinct in a few years. So they figured out a time portal, and they sent basically every person here. You were draft eligible if you could hold a gun. And they have this. Well, I don't know how it ended, but I just couldn't do it.
So Steven Seagal, this is what he's looking like these days.
Oh boy,
He didn't quite this.
he needs to go to that Bezos clinic.
But it says here nationality: American, Serbian, Russian.
Mm-hmm.
So I was right.
Yeah.
I guess he's Russian too. Maybe I don't know.
So we turn off the movie. I mean, we were tired, and because I was like, if you could have done this without having to travel through time, I might have been in. But that was the problem. And the aliens was kind of like that movie Alien. The people, the thing they were fighting.
Yeah.
I was like, is it the same thing with the teeth every time? I mean,
Yeah.
Well,
come up with a different alien.
why?
Now that was a good one. That was a scary one. But I mean,
It was.
after a while.
Yeah, I remember one of the Bible scholars that we know made a point that humans can only come up with what they know. It's like every even monster that they all have the basic features
Yeah.
of a human.
Yeah.
They because our minds just can't comprehend anything
Right.
other than
What we
we
know.
know, which is kind of the foundation of, where did we come up with the idea of good and evil? Because a lot of people, once they get off the rails with God, they're like, well, where did even good and evil come
So
from?
usually it's big eyes, scary teeth, and
A lot of teeth.
claws. A lot of claws.
Same as you go out in the woods.
Yeah.
Because you think about things that get your attention. It's things with claws
Mm-hmm.
and teeth and stingers.
Stingers.
It had
fangs.
all three of
Yeah.
those, but it could throw its stingers.
Oh boy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
It was like a big old ground wasp with tails and kind of a cross between an octopus and a wasp.
So how was Chris Pratt holding up?
Oh, well, I liked him in the movie. I thought
He's pretty funny.
Yeah, it was real. It was funny.
That's why he and Willie palled around, because he has a really great sense of humor.
Yeah.
He started out on a comedy, on that Parks and Recreation.
Yeah, it wasn't.
He was a very good dude.
It wasn't a slap on the editing or the cinematography or the acting or the humor. It just the idea. I'm like, okay, you got to space travel to fight. I don't know.
There's not much of a sci-fi guy. I probably would like this
Well, you probably would, but and maybe it got better. So then when it goes off, as soon as I turn it off, I don't watch the news much, but the news was on, and we were talking about the 4th of July and Declaration of Independence, and everybody coming together, and well, the blurb came up in the 2 minutes that I happened to watch the news, was that there were 400 shootings over the July 4th weekend in the U.S. 150 deaths, 400 shootings. And I was like, what in the world? That's a lot.
Yeah.
And so I have to go do the research because they were basically using it as, we got to do something about these guns.
Yeah, it's always the
And so I was like, let me get the context of what's going on here. What I noticed is most of them were big inner cities.
Inner city.
Yeah, like Chicago was
Most of it, probably.
a lot of it, and New York City, but there was one that kind of got my attention in just outside of Atlanta. Of course, they said in the rural parts of Georgia, but when I looked at the Google map, it was just outside it.
Yeah.
But a guy who had, and they did a story about it because he was a believer and he had just prayed and been on they did some kind of walkathon where they were praying for, and they said he was a person of faith. He was a golf pro working at a golf course, and somebody had pulled a truck on the green, one of the greens, which is never a good sign.
No.
He goes out there to check it out, and whoever pulled the truck out there shot him, killed him.
Yeah. I heard about this.
And there was 2 people in the back of the truck. One of them was the owner of the truck, and they hadn't got him up to this point right now. They don't know. And so, I read that and I thought,
So the person driving the truck stole the truck and killed the 2 people
well,
that own the truck? Is that what it's
one of the people in the back of the truck was the owner of the truck, who was dead.
Yeah.
Who was the owner? So you're putting the
gotcha.
pieces together.
Right.
So who knows who the other? And look, I read a little blurb this big, but the reason I'm bringing this up because you feel this guy had a wife and 2 sons, like 6 and 7. It's just awful. He's a believer.
When you think about that though, so this guy has probably the safest job in America. I mean,
You would think.
Other than people griping about the condition of the golf course, it's about the toughest thing you got as a golf pro. Until somebody drives a truck on a green and shoots you. I mean, you're talking about just never know. What's going to, if you think about it, Jase, the impracticality of that even happening. What a tragedy.
Lawlessness
Yep.
is reaching a point where
Yeah. Scratching your head out.
You have to watch every move you make.
But what ticked me off about it is because you feel for somebody that leaves a family like this.
Mm-hmm.
So here's a guy minding his own business, and we're in Romans, and these are the types of things that happen that are unexplainable from a human perspective. But when you see where this started on a blurb on the news saying we got to do something about these guns, I'm thinking it's way bigger.
Mm-hmm.
You're not gonna, of course, I'm preaching to the choir here, as the right to bear arms was obvious in the founder's plan, because when you look at these inner cities and you think, well, what kind of plan would work better than gun control? Because these are the most gun control environments in our country, and that's where all the mischief happens.
Well, what's amazing, Jase, is the missing the point, which is again the theme of Romans 9-11 about missing the point. Let's take a break. So this podcast, Jase, we're talking a lot about stressors, things that happen that cause people stress, which happens a lot in our current culture and society. But one of the things you don't want to be stressed about is male pattern baldness. You stressed about that, Jase?
No, I haven't experienced that, Al.
Well, hopefully you never will. But the good news is, if you do, we have one of our sponsors that can help you. They help you keep your hair. It's called keeps.com. And they have a FDA-approved hair loss treatment. They're basically generic versions, so you only pay about half the cost that you would for the other stuff. You go online, keeps.com. You're going to answer a few questions. They send them a picture of your hair. A licensed doctor is going to review your info, make sure everything's healthy for you, and you can keep your hair. So it's keeps.com, keeps.com/door. They're going to give you 50% off your first order. So that's keeps.com/door, and don't be stressed about losing your hair. But the point is the reason why people are buying so many guns, which we have a constitutional right to do, is because of the lawlessness. I mean,
Yeah.
Well, it makes me think I need another. When I read about a golf pro walking out to a golf hole with a guy parked on the green, I'm thinking we need to be armed because we never know who might try to shoot you. I mean, so
I got to thinking.
it's just the opposite in thinking.
I got to thinking off the top of my head because people say, we got to do something with these guns. That was the nature of the piece that they were given. I thought, I got a plan for you. Go into these inner cities. They have less trees than rural places. So I know we can agree on this. Let's plant some trees. Let's get rid of all these buildings that have been abandoned. Yep. And they're sitting there because when I read through all the crimes, a lot of them took place at, let's go have a 4th of July party at this abandoned building. A shooting broke out and let's bulldoze all those and plant some trees. So everybody's even right, left, middle, everybody's in on that.
Everybody likes trees.
Yeah. Then let's any kind of, because you think about how much they're taxed. They have the strictest gun laws and they're the most taxed. So let's take this money, which I'm for cutting the taxes because it's not working.
Right.
I saw just the other day where I think the budget in Los Angeles for dealing with their homeless people is $1 billion a year with a B.
And that number is now about 60,000 people, by the way. So it's not working.
It's not working, but that's another story. But take this money and then you come up with these kind of programs, any kind of faith-based program that is helping people get off drugs and alcohol, and you pour your resources into that because they're the ones that are doing the work that you think you could do as some kind of government-operated program. They're the ones doing the work. You need to give them the green light. They shouldn't pay any taxes.
That's right. Just build them places and let them do what they do because they got it.
Exactly. And you can stay away from the fringe groups. Then I would have a training program, firearms training. So my point is we need more guns and more training for people who have good intentions to use them to help in these situations, especially when there's any kind of place where crowds gather. We need people, schools, churches, golf courses, because that's one I hadn't thought about. Yep. But people gather.
Right.
Because you got to remember, I think the common theme is there's more people in the big cities. Right. And so you got more of a, you got more mischief that's going to happen just because there's
and they've
people.
made it just about a policing issue. Either don't like the police, but it's way bigger than just the police. There's no way you could police all this. It's too many.
You got to remember.
Then you get into counseling and mental health issues. You fund all in that because some of that may be some of it.
You got to remember, in the context of what we're talking about, here comes a person who, as it is written, never made a mistake. He's living in a time frame where there were no guns. Gunpowder had not been developed. There were no guns. Mm-hmm. So it's the day when Jesus walked the earth. From that time on, Jesus began to explain to his disciples, this is in lieu of going into Romans, that he must go, this is in the 30s, late 20s and 30s, that he must go to Jerusalem and suffer many things, and here's the group that's going to cause the suffering. He's at the hands, he'll suffer many things at the hands of the elders, highly religious, incredibly religious. I'm in Matthew 16. And also, he's going to be turned over to the chief priests, more religious people, and teachers of the law, more religious people. No guns, but he must be killed and on the third day be raised to life. Well, he says that once. You turn one page, that's Acts 16. I turn a page. Right after he said that, he said this, the Son of Man is going to be betrayed into the hands of men. They will kill him, and on the third day, he will be raised to life. So I turn another page. We're going up to Jerusalem. This is Matthew 20. We're going up to Jerusalem. Why keep repeating this is my point. and the Son of Man will be betrayed to the chief priests, religious people, teachers of the law, the best religious people on the earth. They will condemn him to death. I mean, he never makes a mistake. And there's no guns, but death is everywhere you look. You say, well, what's your point? The lawlessness that we're seeing now, Al, it's always been there.
Exactly.
Just go all the way back.
Yep.
And you say, here's the perfect person to say and over and over and over, I'm fixing to be turned over to this bunch. They're very religious, and they're going to kill me. Well, if these are the religious people, what in the world was going on 2,000 years ago in these streets that were coming from the non-religious people?
Oh, yeah.
I mean, they were doing the same thing with swords, rocks, and crosses.
Yeah. So he'll turn him over to the Gentiles, to the Romans, to be mocked, flogged, and crucified. On the third day, he'll be raised alive. Well, that's Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was a blood fest. Well, when you get to the book of Acts, that first thing you look around and you say, they're after these apostles. They're trying to kill them. They are killing them. Stephen gives them a speech. He said, yeah, you stiff-necked, you claim to be religious, and you killed all the prophets coming up to now, and now you kill the one who's come to die for the sins of the world. He said, so here's my point. You can add all this up, but as far as expecting human beings to do good, unless God is firmly implanted in their heart, and they are walking by the Spirit of God, if you're going to find any good, look there. But that's compared to the world's population, that's a very small percentage. I don't want to dampen everybody's feelings here this morning. I'm just saying.
Well, that's why I had a plan.
We say, well, guns are the problem. I'm like, so swords were the problem here.
Yeah.
So the hearts of men, you get to look at it, you're like, no, it's the hearts of mankind. When they turn and the evil one is turned loose, read John 8, the father of lies and murder. Yeah. Well, Jesus told those people, you belong to him. He's your father. He's the father of lies and murder, by the way. Y'all, I'm telling you, if you'll listen, the truth will set you free. I will set you free by what I'm fixing to do. But no, y'all are sitting there bad-mouthing me, and you're ready to kill me. You want to kill me. Well, So if you read the context leading up to the book of Romans, when the Apostle Paul, it's like you said, Al, hey, Jase, he was one of them. He's right in there when they got Stephen and took him out there. He's saying, hit him again with another rock. He's holding their clothes. Yeah. And that's where he came from and then wrote the book of Romans. You're like, he was one of them.
Pretty amazing.
Is it amazing?
Well, that was my whole point is the plan. They need Jesus. They need to promote things that get people off evil behavior. They need to have counseling, mental illness centers. They need to, grow some trees, participate in outdoors, spread out a little bit. All these things are common sense things that would work a lot better than every time something happens railing about there's too many guns, which, and the fifth most important is do the opposite. We need more guns with people with good intentions.
The people of 2,000 years ago shows me that you don't need guns to be a murderous bunch of thugs.
Exactly.
There's plenty of equipment around where you can kill people. They never heard of gunpowder this much, but there were some more murders probably then than now, the way I'm reading it. I think there's just as many, depending on the population, not as many people on the earth, but there was a lot of killing going on.
Well, you remember
it looks like to me, I read all the way back to Genesis, there's been a whole lot of killing going on the whole time mankind's been on the earth.
That's what I was going to say. Let's take another break. That you go back to Genesis 6, and he said every thought in every heart of everybody that was living at the time, which I don't know what the number was, but they'd been populating, quite a bit, and they lived a lot longer. First thing,
much smaller population than now.
and every heart was filled with evil and violence.
Yep.
And so that's all the way back. And so whatever they were doing then, they were doing it without guns as well. But in fact, he rebooted the whole earth over it.
Yeah.
You know, I mean,
you get to a point, because a lot of people, you could throw in another one, like quit electing corrupt leadership in these big towns. But if everyone's corrupt,
it's like
who you got to choose from?
Dad and I've said it for years. Politics is downstream of culture. So if you got a bad culture, you're going to have bad politicians. I mean, that's what's going to happen. You're producing the representation you deserve.
Miss Kay read me an article yesterday in the paper. I'm sitting on she just was reading it.
Does she still get a paper, like a newspaper?
She reads a newspaper. And she
still have newspapers.
I hadn't seen a newspaper in years.
Where church attendance from the 18 to 23, 24-year-old, that particular group, the younger people, it's dropped about 40% in the last decade.
Yep.
I mean, they're
a lot.
They're hitting the road. They are getting out of there. They said backbiting, gossip. They said they just couldn't take it. Too many rules. They come up with about 5 reasons why they're checking it to the whole bunch. But they are coming out of the religious groups by the droves, saying, I've had enough of it.
And we talked about it just in your generation, Dad.
Yep.
Think about how many people back in the 50s were pretty much, churchgoers. And even if they didn't have it all on straight, just culturally, it was a lot kinder, gentler
way
place.
More.
Yeah, now it's a violent, difficult place,
Yep.
But you're right. I mean, we know the answer. So we'll go back and kind of dive a little bit into Romans 9, 10, 11. Just a little bit of overview, because to Dad's point, Paul was he said the chief sinners, and the reason he said that, the chief and the worst, is because he was one of those guys that killed Stephen and a lot of other people, threw him in jail. I mean, and these are all his brothers and sisters. I've always thought about it. Can you imagine how hard it would have been, even after Paul got a few years on him? He goes in and to a church, and there's people there.
These inner cities was full of the Saul of Tarsus types.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, you could die in a hurry.
That's right. But can you imagine being in a small group setting where he's, maybe he's in that house when the guy fell out the window, and you're looking around speaking, and maybe there's a mother over there of somebody that you had killed or thrown in prison. He had to deal with that every day.
Oh.
And that, I mean, just the guilt of all that. I think that's why Paul, was so passionate about what he talks about, because he was one of them. Yep. So in chapter 9, we basically talked about the Israel misunderstanding their role. I mean, God had brought them as a chosen, elected people to bring about the Messiah to save the whole world. But generally, they missed that. I mean, some individuals got it, but for the most part, they missed it.
They missed it.
So then you get to chapter 10, and Paul makes the case that Israel doesn't have an excuse, just because, you think you were.
It's not rocket science.
That's right. It's pretty simple the way he lays it out. But he's also very passionate about it because, like you said, he desperately wants them to be saved. And he even said in chapter 10, I would give up, I would be cut off forever from God if it meant my people would get it right.
Which is a theme in Romans about no excuses.
Yeah.
Have you noticed that?
That's right.
Chapter 1, he said,
men are without excuse.
Yeah, and then chapter 2, he said the same thing. I mean, over and over, it's like, that's what humans do.
Right.
Make excuses.
Well, it's like I talked about in my sermon, guys. They want to be victims. Nothing's my fault.
Yeah.
I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you after me? It's not my fault. It was the way I was raised. It was, I didn't have this or I didn't have that. It's you always go to that excuse mentality.
The people who cancel others in Romans 2, therefore you have no excuse. You who pass judgment on someone else, for at whatever point you judge the other, you're condemning yourself, because you who pass judgment do the same things. I mean, he's saying you rail against people who pull sinful acts. We wrote a blog, it appeared, about how people operate on planet Earth, and they judge others, but all along, their problem is they're full of sin too. all have sinned.
Right.
In other words, all the founding fathers, they pick them out and they say, well, look, they had slaves, they did this, they did that, like they weren't sinful guys. Everybody that's ever been on planet Earth is a sinful person except Jesus. And the way out is just be forgiving. But the bunch in Romans 2 saying, well, we're not as bad as this bunch in Romans 1, but we will decide who's a good person and who's a bad one. So they put everybody under judgment, pass judgment on everybody, and they themselves condemn themselves because of it.
Right.
They're sinful too.
And what Paul does is interesting because in 9, 10, and 11, he goes back and he pulls passages out of the prophets where God is telling them all through history, you're disobedient, you're stiff-necked, you're not listening to me, you're not being faithful. And over and over and over, he keeps having that consistent message. And yet still, here we are in the first century, and for the most part,
because of your stubbornness and your unrepentant heart, you're storing up wrath against yourself for the day of God's wrath when his righteous judgment would be revealed. He said he's going to clear it all up when he shows back up. I gave a lesson yesterday. My lesson was the day of the Lord.
Yeah.
You know, about what kind of people ought you to be.
Yeah.
I mean, you know, he's coming. Well, here's one of the reasons he's coming. He'll give to each person according to what he's done. You know, you'll either have lived by faith at some point, or you'll be running the other way when he shows up. Right. I'd rather be running toward him when he appears than be running away from him trying to hide.
Right. Yeah, me
because
too.
There won't be any hiding.
That's exactly right. Nowhere to go, right?
Nope.
So we get to chapter 11, and, you know, he's made a strong case about the rejection of Jesus by the Jewish people, you know, like I said, generally. But then he gets to chapter 11, and it's kind of interesting because he asks 4 different questions. He's kind of making his own argument, so he's asking these questions. And he starts out, he says, did God really reject his people? Did God reject his people? In other words, in totality, is it impossible for them to be saved? And he says, by no means, I'm an Israelite myself, a descendant of Abraham from the tribe of Benjamin. So he's using himself as an example that you can get it right, but you have to embrace Jesus, which is what
he's letting them know he was part of the seed line.
That's right.
Of Abraham.
Oh, yeah. And he says that quite often. He was a Hebrew of Hebrews. Let's take another break. So then he gets to verse 2, and he says, God did not reject his people whom he foreknew. In other words, he's saying they rejected him. Don't you know what the scripture says in the passage about Elijah, how he appealed to God against Israel? Lord, they have killed your prophets and torn down your altars. I am the only one left, and now they're trying to kill me. So he uses Elijah as his sort of his example of, you know, sometimes you get to thinking there's nobody out there.
I'm the last one standing.
I'm the last one standing, which is understandable why he would say that. I know Jase had some thoughts about back in 1 Kings about Elijah. Because
it's a good read in 1 Kings 17 and 18, all the way really to 2 Kings 1 and 2. I mean, you probably know more of the history than I do, but Elijah, like other famous prophets and forefathers way back, kind of saw the vision of the gospel before it happened.
Yeah.
Because you remember the story with the widow. He met this widow, and because he was hungry, he was out in the desert, which is not unlike some of the other characters who follow God. John the Baptist comes to mind. And she's like, well, I don't have much to eat here, and if you eat it, we both gonna die, you know.
And she had a boy, you know. She
had a boy, and it was a strange miracle. It's like she kept feeding him and giving him drink, and it never would run out. It's like she didn't have to go to the store. I don't know exactly where exactly that is, but it's in
1 Kings 17.
Yeah, in 17. Well, and then her son dies, and so she blames him because she's like, well, if you hadn't come, maybe this is something bad has happened. So Elijah prays, and next thing you know, he's resurrected. So it's almost like he saw that death, burial, and resurrection occur before Jesus from the power of God. and he was one of the few humans, there's a couple others, that didn't die.
Yeah, he was caught up in a whirlwind, it said. Some kind of fiery...
Do you have a funeral for that?
Hard to say.
Well, so he was like that, and Moses said he went up to a mountain to die, and God buried him there, whatever that means. Yeah. And then in the Transfiguration,
Matthew 17,
those two showed up, have a little convo with Jesus. So I don't know. It's a kind of a bizarre.
It helps my feelings.
It does me too.
Well, one of the famous things about Elijah that I like, which Paul's making the point in Romans. I mean, here's Elijah. We're down to just a few people, and you got to remember that about our culture because everybody gets negative. But it's been worse. I mean, they were down to where there was just a few thousand people who would put their faith and trust in God. I mean, talking about outnumbered.
And it came from their leadership because Ahab was the king, and he married a woman named Jezebel, who was a sort of believed in all these false gods. And so she had filled Israel with all these false, they had the Asherah poles. And of course, this was a very cultish religion. And so the deal was, if you wanted to have crops, you had to go out and have sex with whoever you could underneath these altars. And so the immorality was just rank throughout all of Israel. This was a very low point for the nation.
Well, and that's what I like about these types of moments in the Old Testament, because we're just giving you a thumbnail. But in 1 Kings 18, they're having this big fight about who's the real God. And so Elijah's like, well, okay, you pray to your God, I'll pray to mine.
They had, 850 of them.
Yeah, and you read like in 18:24, 1 Kings, it says, then you call on the name of your God, and I'll call on the name of the Lord, the God who answers by fire. He's God. And all the people said, oh, what you say? Oh, this sounds like a plan. I mean, I'd love to have been a fly.
It was a showdown
on some donkey poop back then. And so then 27 says, because they were in the desert, wasn't no walls. At noon, Elijah began to taunt them because they were, they started shouting to their God, but nothing was happening. He said, maybe you should shout louder. Surely he is a God, or perhaps he is deep in thought or busy or traveling. Maybe he's sleeping and must be awakened. And I like that because I thought he was kind of a trash talker.
He was.
Yeah.
And in any competition, I view trash talking.
And by the way, that
favorable.
was a very, I would call it a kind translation. If you look back at the actual Hebrew, when it says he was deep in thought, he really meant he was in the back. He was using the restroom. Is what the phrase actually meant, which makes it even better to me. Hey, maybe he's on the pot. Maybe he's, let's go get him out of there.
Of course, I can't remember if it was that one or whatever, where he filled up the troughs in the water, and then I believe it was that one. And then God rained down the fire. And
by the way, they were in a drought. It hadn't rained in 3 years. So he took precious, valuable water and poured it all over his altar and everything he had set up, and then there's water all over it.
Yeah. But then when eventually in 2 Kings 1, this is right before he is taken up, he has another one of these things. This leader of the captain of the army kept bringing 50 men up, and they're telling him they're dictating policy, and fire keeps raining down on each 50. And so by about the third group of 50, they come down in humility then, and they're like, hey, would it be okay? Look, we're just trying to have a conversation with you. Stop. And it's just an interesting story, but I think it brings more to light what Paul is referencing there.
Right.
As when God's on your side, just because you're a few, that should be nothing as far as power is concerned. I mean, he displayed it right here. I mean, they literally were controlling the world and were the moral compass of the world, because if God is for you, who can be against you? Which is what he said earlier in Romans. But I want to bring this up. He's taken up to heaven, and he he kind of has this Moses moment where he's walking across a river and he strikes it and land forms, and he walks it with Elisha. So
Who's his replacement.
Who's his replacement, which is kind of a picture of what happened with Moses, I guess, and Joshua, in that we're going to pass the torch, which remember, Moses and Elijah were the two guys at the Transfiguration. And so Elijah asked him, he says, because Elijah said, I'll give you whatever you ask. And he said, well, I would like your spirit times 2. And he's like, hey, we'll pray to God if he wants to do it. And so the first thing that happens...
He wanted the double whammy. Let's take one last break now.
After that is one of the most unusual passages in the Bible. And this is chapter 2. Now, so Elijah, he takes off on the whirlwind. And so now Elijah told him he had the power, but he goes to Bethel. And to Al's point, you have all this idolatry worship going on. And this place is supposed to be the house of God.
Right.
And it's just corrupt. The world is just off the rails. And so as he was walking along the road, some youths came out of the town and jeered him. Now, some translations, I believe, got this wrong. You know, the more I studied this, it was their word for... It's kind of like what I just told you about the U.S. when it had these 400 shootings. Well, one of the articles I read about it said, 3 kids die, and so I read that. Well, it was like 15, 19, and 16. I'm like, well, I pretty much know they said a disagreement about something and a shootout. But the way it looked was, there were some kids, and there was a kid killed as an innocent bystander, which was 6 years old. Now that's horrible.
Yeah, it's terrible.
But I'm pretty sure, reading between the lines, that when you're 15 to 19,
in these gang areas,
that you're in the prime of your criminal career.
Yeah.
So, and I think that's what was going on here. If you look that word up, you'll see that. But they came out of the town and jeered him. Go on up, you bald head. They said, go on up, you bald head. And when you research this, you realize, because hair back then was a sign of, kind of like our family, of honor. So evidently, the scholars think that he had some kind of skin condition, or it was not something he was doing purposefully. And they all knew who he was because he represented God, the creator of the universe. And so...
But he looked strange.
Yeah. So he turned around. Of course, he's got a double measure of Elijah's spirit. And they're jeering him. And I really think it's more about the worship, who they're worshiping, and setting the tone. And he called down a curse on them in the name of the Lord, which in and of itself is not necessarily a bad thing, but evidently the Lord heard him. And then guess what happened? 2 bears came out of the woods and mauled 42 of the young rebels.
I've used that verse so many times when I was talking to kids. I said, don't make me call a bear down on you.
I don't think he was really talking about that. I mean, because I do think they were the bullies of the new way of worship or whatever was going on in there when you read the history. They weren't bowing down to God, I can tell you that. And there was a small sect of people that was representing God, and Elijah was the leader of that group at the time, and he passed the torch on to Elijah, but he set the tone that our God is more powerful and real than yours.
Hey, I ain't gonna lie, I've been in some situations where I would love to have had the power to call a bear down on a few people. Just let me just show you what happens when you mess with God's people.
So I think that puts in context the Romans 11 reference, though, about...
Well, and I want to mention one thing before we totally leave that, because in 1 Kings 19, right after it happens, because I find this fascinating, Elijah had just had this major victory on Mount Carmel, because God had shown who God really is. The people chased down all these false prophets and killed them all. So this should have been the greatest time in Elijah's life, but Jezebel sends a message, 1 Kings 19, may the gods deal with me, be it ever so severely. And so she still believes in her false god. If by this time tomorrow I do not make your life like one of them. She sent that message to Elijah. And what was funny is you'd think he would think, I tell you what, this hussy, let me show you what else got. But instead, Elijah was afraid and ran for his life. And he goes out and sits under a broom tree, and that's when he tells God, I'm the only one left, and they're trying to kill me. You might as well just take me on. It just deflated him. And I've always thought, I told people before, sometimes when you have a mountaintop experience and you think, man, this is so good. Maybe it was a great worship or some conference you were at. And then sometimes after that, you get, all of a sudden you get this feeling like he had. I mean, he should have been the most fearless man in all the world after what he just witnessed.
But I think that's his point, Romans 11, Mal. He's like, Elijah, there was only a few of them, and they're flawed. Even though they're trusting in God, they're still flawed.
Right.
Yep.
Just like us.
Yep.
And then he makes the point that so too at the present time there is a remnant chosen by grace, and if by grace, then it's no longer by works. If it were, grace would no longer be grace. I mean,
well, I liked his answer to Elijah was because it said the angel of the Lord took him up on a mountain, and there was an earthquake, and there was a fire, and there was a great wind, and so there was a major happening. But it said God was not in any of those. He came to him in a gentle whisper, and that's when he told him, "I got 7,000 that hadn't bowed the knee." In other words, I got work for you to do.
Well, right.
There is a remnant that's there, which is Paul's whole point when you get over to.
Well, I think that we all struggle with that.
Well, that's why I love that passage, Jase, because I've been in situations before where things are rolling, things are great, but then you have these fears like, am I doing what I'm supposed to be doing? I mean, we all have moments like that. And I think the gentle whisper for any of us is, you got to do what God's called you to do.
Well, that's why I brought up this point about the news and all what's around us. You can't feel like somehow or another hopeless or doomed because there's so many people out there who just said, we don't care if God was hung, shot, crucified, I mean, I think we have to look at the big picture, and there are literally hundreds of thousands of believers out there, more than you think.
Right.
And we're the most powerful people on earth because of God's Spirit and because of His grace. And so whenever you see that, I mean, we shouldn't get negative and gripe, because I do think that translates to our kids.
That's
right. But I think we go to our kids and we say, we got work to do.
I love it when I get invited, to California or Oregon or Washington, some, what we now call a blue state, which is a lot of left-wingers, a lot of people, a lot of unbelievers. I love when I go there because I always find the remnant of people there, they still love God. They're gung-ho for Christ. I mean, and it gives you, it kind of buoys your spirits, because you start thinking, I've heard people say, if the earthquake came and that whole thing just fell off in the ocean, we'd all be better off. But no, the people of God are there. I mean, it just means more work for us to do. I think that's the way you have to view it. That was basically Elijah's challenge,
But the reason I think you read those stories, and I mean, we're kind of laughing about them, but those things really happened, and people really died, and people stood up. They had the courage to stand up and take on God Himself.
Yeah.
And they all lost.
I will say that when God told him that I have 7,000 you don't know anything about, that's not a whole lot.
That's what I'm saying.
Yeah, that's why it was called a remnant, right?
I mean,
he was saying that. He was saying that
far bigger than that. He said, "I got 7,000. You don't even know about it." I'm like, "Phew, that's not that many."
That's right.
7,000. I don't know. So,
well, back in the story, Obadiah, who was also a prophet, who was a contemporary with Elijah, he had hidden out some priests and some people. So there was some things going on. But you're right, it wasn't many. But think about it, you just described it, Dad. There's 300 and 60 million people in America now. I mean, how many of them? What's the remnant of those who are really believe in Christ and professing?
That article yesterday, everything is shrinking. Christianity is shrinking in America. The members of people put their faith in Jesus. There's a lot of turmoil out there. You say, I can see the signs of it, Al.
I can too. Time for revival.
We're trying to head it off.
Thanks for listening to the Unashamed podcast. Help us out by rating us on iTunes. And don't miss an episode by subscribing on YouTube, and be sure to click that little bell to get notified about new episodes. And for even more content that you won't get anywhere else, subscribe to Blaze TV at blazetv.com/unashamed.